Hello, and welcome back to HHH, the podcast where we talk about those horrible humans in history. I am your host, Angela Pearson, and sorry I missed last Thursday's release. You know, Thanksgiving snuck up on me as a new stay-at-home mom. Time is kind of weird for me. I don't know what day it is half the time, so when it was suddenly Thanksgiving, I did not have time to record this episode, so thank you for your patience, and for those of you out of the United States that are listening, even more thank you for your patience because you guys don't have this holiday in your country, so I appreciate your patience. But anyways, welcome if you are new to this channel. Welcome. We're here to talk about the worst of the worst in human history. And if you have been with me from the beginning, thank you so much. I appreciate you listening. Thanks for being here. If you have any suggestions about horrible humans that you would like to hear about, I would like to know. So please make sure you either comment on this episode or you can message me on Facebook or Instagram or any of those platforms. Just let me know what you want to hear, and I am happy to take requests. Also, make sure you're liking and subscribing and hitting the notification button because, like this past week, sometimes things come up, so my episodes get released at a little bit different time. So just make sure you have the notifications and you'll never miss an episode. And like I mentioned, I like taking requests. Today's episode is actually another listener suggestion from Sarah Routledge. Thank you so much for your suggestion, Sarah. We really appreciate it. I'm really excited to talk about this because we are going to be traveling back to somewhere much older than we've been in a while, somewhere foggier, somewhere where this story is wrapped in myth, blood, and propaganda. So this is going to be a good one. This one begins not in a courtroom or a battlefield, but in a cave. A cold, wet cave on the Scottish coast, where, according to legend, one family lived, hunted, and feasted on human flesh for decades. Yeah, that's right. And that's what I said. Today we are exploring the horrifying legend of Sawney Bean, Scotland's most infamous cannibal and the patriarch of a clan said to have murdered and eaten more than 1,000 people. It's one of the darkest folk tales ever told, but here's the thing. No one actually knows if it's for sure true or not. So was Sawney Bean a real person? Or just a monster that was invented to scare people, or worse, to serve as political propaganda? Let's find out, shall we? Now, according to legend, Alexander, quote-unquote, Sawney Bean was born in East Lothian, Scotland, sometime between the 15th and 16th centuries. The accounts kind of vary because we don't really have anything to verify he was really born, because some of the accounts say 1430 is his birth date. Sometimes it says 1590, which already tells us a little something about this story. We're dealing with a story that's been told and retold for centuries. So the details are going to get kind of messy. So we don't have the specific date, but most tellings of this story settle vaguely on around the 15th or early 16th century, making his activity align with the reign of James VI, later James I of England. So that's kind of where we're thinking this is happening, okay? So the earliest written mention of him doesn't actually appear until the early 1700s. again, this is why the details of his life are a little foggy, because this is a long, long, long time after he was supposed to have lived. So that makes a lot of people think this is mythical, but I want you to decide after you've heard the story. So he was born and raised in East Lothian, Scotland. Looked up how to say that, and I literally instantaneously forgot. Sorry, guys. This location appears pretty consistently in all the different stories. It places him in a poor rural community. So his parents are described as very hardworking laborers. His father was either a ditch digger or a hedge trimmer. So that kind of varies between the stories. His mother tried to keep Sawney on a moral path, which she didn't do a super great job at when you hear the rest of this story. So she failed. She failed at her primary job. So anyways, Sawney refused to do honest work because he wanted, quote, an easier life than laboring. He had a reputation for being super duper lazy, and he also had a reputation for being very violent, and he really, really enjoyed intimidating people. He was very cruel, unruly, and socially rejected, and drawn towards deviant behavior very early in life. This is all according to the stories of Sawney Bean. So this behavior, this kind of attitude towards life and society, really sets him up for his crimes later and kind of justifies his rejection from society, because he basically is rejecting society by saying, I'm too good for hard labor. I like scaring the crap out of people, and I'm pretty violent. So at some point in his youth, he decided to leave home and actually fell in love with a woman who shared his outlook on life. Miraculously, there was a woman in this world that agreed with the way he saw the world. A woman sometimes called Agnes Douglas, or in later accounts, they called her Black Agnes. She was said to be just as wicked and corrupt as he was, rumored to have dabbled in witchcraft herself. So her origins, we'll talk about her really quick. It's said that Agnes comes from a nearby village in the lowlands. She had already been cast out of her community before she actually met Sawney Bean. Some versions claim that she was, like I said, accused of witchcraft or practicing unclean acts. Now, I don't know what they mean by unclean acts, but she was accused of practicing these unclean acts. So I'm going to let you use your own imagination to figure out what that means. She was described as vicious, cruel, and uninterested in any form of honest, hard work. So these two are a match made in heaven. Her exile made her bond instantly with Sawney, not to mention their love of cruelty and lack of hard work ethic. So they just felt very rejected by society and bonded with each other over that rejection. So it made a very, very strong bond between the two of them. And together, they fled to the Benin Head Sea Cave, where they began their life outside of the law. So they've been rejected by society. They are searching for a place to live, and they find this cave on the side of the cliffs by the ocean and decide, heck, why not? Let's live in this cave, which, by the way, the mouth of the cave gets covered at high tide and you can't get into it. But at low tide, you're able to. So it's a perfect little hideout. So they find this miraculous cave, which I've seen pictures of, and I will put on Instagram so you can see the pictures of the Benin Head Cave. It is kind of cool looking. Sarah, maybe you can, I don't know if you've been there or not, but maybe give us a shout out on that one. But there's actually no evidence that that Agnes was a real person, but in the stories of Sawney Bean, she is very essential because she's the dark beating heart of this family. Don't worry, there's a family. It's coming. She's the one who helps transform the story from being like a lone killer into a cannibal dynasty. So she is very important to this story because together the pair decided, like I said, to abandon all society's complexity and basically start their own version of society, I guess. And like I said, they found the cave in Benin Head. Well, near Benin Head. And that is actually in the rugged terrain of Ayrshire, the Ayrshire coastline. So if you want to look it up, you can find it as well. And like I said, it was only accessible at low tide. And when the water retreated, you could slip inside pretty quickly. But once it rose again, you were kind of stuck either in the cave or outside of the cave. So you had to time those entrances and exits pretty well. So to most, it would have been a very terrible place to live. I can't imagine living in a sea cave. It sounds terrible to me. Like, granted, if I was desperate for a place to go, that would probably be a good first look, right? Like a good sea cave protected from the elements. But cold, miserable, yeah, it does not sound super great. But for Sawney and Agnes, this was the perfect place. So it was a home hidden from the world, from the law, most especially. So this was their dream home. Just imagine caves dripping and wet and damp, and they're just like, oh, dream home. Yay. Inside the cave, it stretched hundreds of feet deep, winding into dark tunnels, and that's where Sawney and Agnes decided to make their home sweet home. And according to legend, they started their own family pretty quickly, and one that would grow in number and in horror. So at first, the Beans, let's kind of talk about why they're so horrible. So at first, the Beans simply just survived off of theft. They would ambush the travelers that were traveling along the lonely coastal roads by where their cave was located. They would steal all their goods and then disappear back into their little cave. Like, I'm just picturing them like creepily crawling out of their cave and stealing things and then crawling back in like some kind of monster. That's not what they did, but that's what I picture. Anyways, so they would come out and literally just ambush lone travelers, steal their stuff, and then leave, right? But theft, as the stories say, soon turned to something so much worse. They decided that they didn't want to leave any witnesses to the crimes because people were starting to get nervous to travel along those routes because they knew that there was someone out there robbing travelers. So they didn't want anyone to be able to go back and report on the crimes that were happening on this road. So that's when they decided to start murdering their victims. Instead of just robbing them, they would take all their things and murder them. And pretty quickly from murder, they turned to cannibalism. Yes, that's right. These people decided that the best way to hide a body was to eat it. Blah, blah, blah. So the legend claims that Sawney and Agnes realized that people, like I said, were starting to really take notice of their crimes, and they really needed to fix that. So since it was really common at that time, we've kind of talked about this before, how travelers in this time period had a frequency of disappearing, especially if they were lone travelers by themselves. It wasn't uncommon for people to never hear from their loved ones again. So it wasn't too bad when, they would strike random victims and they would go missing because it was just kind of expected. However, the frequency of people going missing along this specific route was a thing that people were starting to take notice of. So, well, I guess they weren't going missing yet. Sorry, I misspoke. The people getting robbed, they're not going missing yet. Eventually, everyone would start noticing that people were going missing. But right now, it's just a common report that you would get robbed if you took this route. But they decided we don't want to leave witnesses, so we're going to kill our victims. But again, they had another problem. What do you do with the bodies? You can't just leave them there because obviously people are going to find them. So, like I said, they began to butcher their victims, bring them back to the cave, or they would cut up their victims and just throw them into the sea. And soon, little villages downstream or down current, I guess would be the right term because it's not a river, it's the ocean. Down current from them would start having body parts wash up on shore. And people started to take note of that. I wonder why. Like, if you're in a coastal little town and suddenly body parts start washing up, you're going to take notice and wonder what the heck is happening. So they wanted to lower that suspicion. So instead of throwing them into the ocean, they brought them back to their cave and started eating the flesh of their victims. Not out of necessity, by the way. It wasn't like they were starving. They weren't in their cave struggling to survive with no food. No. They just wanted to do it because they wanted to try eating people. And so that's what they did. And I do want to point out Agnes's role in these crimes because we brought up that she was kind of an important figure in this story. According to the legends, Agnes actually helped plan and execute all the ambushes on the travelers. She was present during the murders and the butchering of the bodies. Some people even believe that she actually directed all of that. She encouraged Sawney's brutality and contributed to maintaining the cannibalistic practices. So she encouraged the eating of their victims. And Agnes is often described as the quote-unquote mother of the twisted family dynamic, normalizing murder and cannibalism for their children from birth. Just imagine this. You're born into a family where it's just normal to eat people. Like, how messed up is that? From birth, you just see people gnawing on people's body parts as part of your normal diet. That is horrific. That is so messed up. Oh. So some of the stories even paint her as more ruthless than Sawney. The true ideological heart of the clan is what she was. She was the one who pushed all of this. So if you were wondering how Sawney's wife was with all of this brutality and eating of people, she was okay with it. In fact, she probably was the one who had the idea or the brains behind the operation, as some people might say. Now, they had found a way to thrive in their little cave. Their family began to grow, and they created a lot of little bean monsters. Reportedly 8 sons and 6 daughters. Yeah, that's quite the crew. That is a big number of children. And I'm sure you can guess what that meant. Their appetite grew. So ambushing 1 or 2 travelers at a time isn't going to suffice when you're trying to feed that many children. And soon all the kids started participating in the quote-unquote family business. So it wasn't just mom and dad going out hunting. Is that the right word to use? Ugh, I don't like that. But it wasn't just mom and pop. No. All the children started joining in on the planning, joining in on the ambushing and the butchering. So it was just a family affair. And eventually, Sawney actually had 18 grandsons and 14 granddaughters. And I'm sure you have the same thought that I had, which was, who would voluntarily join this family? Like, who's out there, like, meeting these sons or daughters and being like, you know what? I also want to be a part of that family business. That sounds phenomenal. I love eating people. Yeah, like, who's voluntarily signing up for this? Well, rest at ease, dear listener. There was no voluntarily joining of this horrible family. All the grandkids were a product of incest. So much better, right? Oh my gosh. This story is just wild. So now they've got a literal clan of women, children, adult men that are able to ambush now large parties of travelers. So they would organize nightly raids, ambushing groups, no longer just single travelers, groups of travelers, killing them and carrying their bodies back to the cave for butchery and preservation. Yeah, they preserved these bodies. I just picture like pickled toes on the shelf and them being like, hey, I want some of those for snacky snack. Oh, so gross. They would salt the flesh to make it last through the winter and stored it in barrels. Like, seriously, it's just, such heebie-jeebies. Like, I started watching the Frankenstein movie on Netflix. If you've never seen it, totally fine. You don't need to. But there's a scene in the show, and if you've seen it, you'll know what I'm talking about, that made me think of this. And this is what I pictured, because there's literally just limbs everywhere, stacked everywhere, just like, and that's how I pictured this cave, just full of all of that, like, bones, and oh my gosh, it's so horrific. Anyways, moving on. So the cave itself is said that when they actually discovered it and found the family in there, that it would reek of death. I mean, I wouldn't expect it to smell like flowers or fresh spring rain at this point in time, so it does make sense that it would reek of death. And it's said that it was filled with bones, severed limbs, piles of stolen possessions. And like I said, that sounds like a dreamland to grow up in this cave. It's just so homey and warm and cozy. Oh gosh. The image is in my brain. Frankenstein. That's all I gotta say. That's what I'm picturing. All right. So they were able to go through with these crimes for 25 years. Yeah, that's right. 25 years. 25! And the clan robbed and killed innocent travelers that whole time and ate their bodies. Ugh. It said they would have murdered anyone unlucky enough to cross their path. Some accounts claim that their total victim count was over 1,000 people. That is crazy that they were able to do this for 25 years, kill that many people, nobody noticed. I mean, I'm sure there were stories of like, ooh, careful, don't take this road. Like, that people were like, oh, I got robbed on this road. I'm sure there started to be rumors. There had to be rumors like, if you take that route, you may never come back. Like, that had to have been a thing. 1,000 people? How does no one like... Anyways. So it's kind of a story that sounds too grotesque to be true, yet believable enough that it really terrified people. So outside the cave, Scotland was in chaos. Travelers were vanishing by the dozens, and people were finally starting to take notice after 25 years. I mean, how do you not notice large parties just vanishing off of the face of the planet? If it was one or two lone travelers, I feel like, okay, whatever. Sometimes it happens because that's just how things worked back then. But they began attacking large parties. So much so that search parties were formed. Entire villages were panicking, especially when they started finding like the body parts floating in the ocean. People were starting to accuse innocent innkeepers of the crimes because they were saying, well, you're the ones killing these travelers because I'm sure they stayed in your inn. So you must have done something to them. But they had never committed these crimes. Some of these innkeepers were even executed for the disappearances because people were so freaked out. All the while, the real culprits were hiding in plain sight in their tidy little cave that got covered at high tide. How convenient for them. By the time the authorities actually caught on, the Bean family had been killing for, like I said, almost 3 decades, and their downfall, as with so many other crimes, came down to one little mistake. So one night, the Bean clan ambushed a man and his wife traveling home from a fair, most likely the air market. I don't know what that is, but it sounds fun. Some of these stories say the couple was a merchant couple, they were farmers, or a wealthy tradesman. What the Beans didn't know, though, is that this man was a trained fighter. He was going to fight. The Beans managed to drag the wife off of her horse and killed her right in front of the man before he could react. And some of the stories even say that they literally started ripping her apart and eating her right there in front of her husband. Like, oh, what a horrific scene. Can you imagine? They're just so hungry and just monsters tearing this woman apart in front of her husband. And as he watched his wife get dismembered in front of him, that gave him the courage to fight and fight harder and fight back even more fiercely when he saw what was happening to his wife. He used a sword and a pistol to drive the cannibals away. And before they were able to kill him, another group of travelers returning from the same fair actually approached along the road, which scared the Beans and forced them to flee back to their cave. The husband was found soaked in blood, but he was still alive. This was their first survivor of their attacks. And the new arrivals saw the remnants of the attack, including this poor wife's mangled body. And together, they escorted the husband back to the nearest town. Now, this is a very crucial moment because the Beans never left witnesses, which is why they supposedly evaded detection for decades. And this man became their first known survivor. And don't worry, he wasn't going to let them disappear into the night. So it escalated really quickly because the husband filed a formal complaint with local authorities. And this escalated pretty quickly because sometimes when people would file official complaints, it would get lost and nothing really much would ever happen. But this specific complaint got escalated because the authorities had noticed that there had been an increase in murders and the locals were panicking. So with the multiple disappearances that were already underway and being investigated, it was really easy for the authorities to act on this one because they were like, aha, we finally have a lead in all of the things that we're trying to investigate. So the survivor was brought before King James VI of Scotland. This is the same James who would later rule England as James I. He was outraged. He was so mad that he organized a massive manhunt, which included 400 soldiers, bloodhounds to sniff them out, and they combed the countryside. Now, King James VI, sometimes James I, so just reminder on that one, he actually personally got involved because he actually led the search party and was determined to settle the growing panic in southern Scotland. He wanted a resolution because he saw his people were freaking out. Now, the husband directed the king's men to the ambush site, so they were able to get the exact location of where this happened. Now, following trails of blood and disturbed ground, I'm sure they had a path to and from their little cave. They tracked the route back to Benin Head, where they were able to find the hidden cave entrance only at low tide. So they were finally able to find this cave. And when the men arrived, they saw nothing, just waves and rocks. But the dogs were the ones who had caught the scent of death and led them straight to the mouth of the cave. So when you looked over the side of the cliff, it just looked like nothing, but the dogs were able to lead them to the actual entrance of the cave. Now inside, using torches, they were able to illuminate the nightmare that laid inside and discovered the gruesome remains of human limbs hanging from hooks, barrels full of salted meat, heaps of bones, and the Bean family, dozens of them, cowering in the shadows. This is such a creepy image in my mind. You know how people's eyes sometimes reflect the light? Just imagine these caves, you're walking through and seeing all these limbs and things, and you're just seeing eyes reflecting from the darkness of people cowering and hiding. And imagine these children who were raised in this, and this was just how they were raised, don't know that they were doing anything wrong, and so they're terrified because these people are coming for them. Oh my gosh, this whole situation is... Ugh. Anyways, so... this would ultimately lead to the capture and execution of Sawney Bean and his entire family. So they were dragged from the cave and brought before the king. In some versions, there was a trial in Edinburgh. In others, James ordered immediate execution. The men were said to have had their hands and feet chopped off and left to bleed to death, and the women and children were burned alive. And then they said that they sealed the cave so no one else could enter in there. So basically ending this entire nightmare. So that's the story. But now we have to ask, did this actually happen? Is the Bean family real? Because here's the strange part. There's no actual record of this event ever taking place. There's no trial transcript. So if there was a trial, they didn't keep any records, which seems odd. But if there wasn't a trial and they just killed them on the spot, that would make sense. There would be no trial transcript. But there also is no royal decrees. There's no reference to Sawney Bean in Scottish or English court documents of the time. Which again, if they just killed them on the spot, that would make sense. But where's the royal decrees? Saying there's terror happening in this area. If it's not there, did it happen? Good question. And again, the earliest written version appears in the 1700s in an English pamphlet printed long after these events supposedly took place. And that's kind of a big red flag when it comes to history. There should be more documentation sooner than that, right? So let's look at some of the possible explanations about this story. So, this story could have been political. Now, I'm sure if you're not from the area, you're asking, how is that even possible? If you're from the area, this might make sense to you because you would know more of the history. So, during the 17th and 18th centuries, England and Scotland were in deep political tension. And I feel like that's a big understatement, deep political tension. I don't know if there's words to express how deep that political tension was, but it was pretty intense at the time. So many historians actually believe that the tale of Sawney Bean was actually English propaganda. It was a way to portray the Scots as barbaric and uncivilized. So the very name Sawney was actually a derogatory English nickname for Scottish men, like calling someone Scotty in a mocking way. So it's not a compliment to be called that. So by telling stories about Sawney Bean, quote unquote, English publishers could stoke fear and disgust towards their northern neighbors. So it was a way of showing people how awful the Scots were, because look at these horrible people eating people. Like, see, Sawney Bean, that's the Scottish neighbors from above. It's no coincidence that the earliest version appears in a London. Sorry, not Lubin. London broadsheet. That's why I said Lubin, because I was going to say broadsheet next. It's no coincidence that the earliest version appears in a London broadsheet, basically a cheap newspaper, eager for sensational stories, kind of like our tabloids here in the US. That's kind of what these broadsheets are. They want sensational stories. They want to spread these crazy, crazy stories. So Sawney Bean legend might not be Scottish at all. It might be English fiction written to profit and to discredit the Scots. So that's one theory. Another theory is that the story is based on older Scottish folk tales about wild men and cannibals. So it could potentially be a Scottish story. So in medieval Europe, there were common myths of cave dwellers, quote unquote, or quote, wood wozes. People who rejected society and lived off of human flesh. Basically the Sawney Bean story, right? Now, these stories actually served as cautionary tales. Step too far from civilization and you become something monstrous. So it was kind of a warning to children that you need to step in line with society or else you could become this horrible, horrible monster. So even if Sawney Bean wasn't real, the story carried a moral, a warning about savagery, isolation, and sin. So those are kind of the two theories as to where the story might have come from. But here's the important part. There is no historical evidence for Agnes Douglas. There's no historical evidence for Sawney Bean. There's no documents, no family accounts, nothing in Scottish archives. And specifically with Agnes, she fit the trope of the evil matriarch, quote unquote. You know, I always do the air quotes thinking you guys can see me doing those. So I remember after the fact that I need to say I'm quoting something. Sorry. So many medieval and early modern tales included villainous women accused of witchcraft or seduction who would lead men astray. So she fit that perfectly. If you look at her story, that's exactly what she was. And Agnes Douglas, the name specifically, may have been chosen to sound aristocratic. So the Douglas family was actually a very powerful Scottish clan. And by using the surname Douglas or Agnes in a villainous story, it might have been fueled by political tension to, you know, paint the Douglases as fierce monsters that you don't want to deal with. So, you know, again, politics could have played a pretty big role in this story. And she helped to justify the scale of the Bean clan. So to explain such a huge cannibal family, they needed a really fertile, complicated partner who could raise the clan to be completely deprived. So they needed to have her in this story because I don't know a lot of women that are just like, heck yeah, let's be cannibals. She would have to be a psycho. And, you know, she fits that perfectly in this story. And her villainy makes Sawney's evil look inherited and ingrained. So instead of one madman, the story becomes about an entire anti-society living underground. So it's not just Sawney Bean being a rebel. It's literally a degeneracy in multiple people in a group of people that are shirking societal norms kind of thing. So it does seem pretty mythy to me. I have my doubts if it's real, But over the centuries, over many, many, many storytellings, things get shifted and changed. Like eventually Agnes becomes ugly and malformed. And in some of the other stories, she performs certain rituals in the cave. I don't know what these rituals are. It just says rituals. And she was the mother monster, which, I don't disagree with when you read the story. She is kind of the mother monster. And she was the one to supposedly encourage the incest within her family. So the story twists and turns as time goes on. And again, none of these additions are historical. They're just sensational flourishes that make the story way more interesting and attractive to people who want a good story. Now, some historians point to a real incident that may have inspired the story. So this is where it could have actually begun and then got twisted along the way. So in 16th century Scotland, famine and lawlessness were very common, especially in the remote regions. There are scattered reports of bandits and even cannibalism during the periods of starvation. The name Bean could have been borrowed from a real outlaw family, but over generations, like I said, the details got exaggerated until it became this full-blown legend of insidious cannibal, a tribe of cannibals. So it literally could have been based off of a real incident that took place in the 16th century, but it just got so blown out of proportion that now it's just not the same story. Now, whether or not the Sawney Bean story is true, it stuck. It became a staple of Scottish folklore, appearing in ballads, chapter books, or not chapter books, sorry. I added the chapter. It's actually chap books. When I read chap books, I was like, maybe it's supposed to be chapter books. No, it's chap books. And if you don't know what a chap book is, I didn't either, so I looked it up for you. A chap book is a small, inexpensive booklet historically sold by traveling peddlers called chapmen. So there you go. Fun fact for the day. Chap book, small books. So these stories were in those books, and they eventually appeared in horror fiction. By the 1800s, it was printed in penny dreadfuls, which were very cheap, sensationalized magazines that turned true crime and myth into entertainment. And they were super cheap, so a lot of people read them. And in the 20th century, the legend even crossed the ocean to here in the United States, which it inspired the film The Hills Have Eyes. So if you've ever seen that movie, that is based on the Sawney Bean story, along with some other cannibal horror stories. So fun fact, if you've ever seen that movie, Sawney Bean, real or not, became the blueprint for a monster that never dies. A human predator hiding in the shadows of civilization, which is even more horrific when you think about it because you don't know they're a monster. They look just like everybody else. You think they're just a normal person, and it turns out they're a monster. So, was Sawney Bean real or just a myth? I don't know. Maybe both. It could have been both. Maybe he never existed. But what he represented absolutely does. The legend speaks to something a little bit deeper. Our fear of losing our humanity, of being consumed, not just by others, but get it? Consumed by others. But also our own darkness. Like, we all have the capability. We talk about these horrible humans in history, right? We think, I could never behave like that. I could never participate in that. Like, the dictator regimes, all the people that go out and kill people for these horrible dictators or anything like that. We always think that could never be me. I would never, ever do that. I could never be a cannibal. But it doesn't take long for people's, what's the word? Not personality, but like people to shift into something like that without even noticing. In psychology, they've done experiments where it was the Stanford prison experiment in the 1970s, where it was just students that they threw into, it was literally not even a prison, but they set it up to have guards and prisoners. They're all same students, same status at this school. But for this experiment, some of them were prisoners, some of them were the guards. And it didn't even take 24 hours for the guards to become brutal and abusive to the prisoners. And it was just an experiment. They had no real power, but it was like a flip switch in their brain. So we always think it couldn't be me, but we don't know. I mean, I don't think I would ever eat a person. I'd rather die before I ever ate a person, to be honest. So I don't think I would ever be a cannibal, but you know what I'm talking about. There are monsters inside all of us. So that's why we're afraid of our own darkness. In a world before police forces, before forensics, stories like Sawney Bean's really filled that void and explained disappearances and warned travelers and gave shape to invisible dangers. That was the best way to keep people safe, is to tell these kinds of scary stories, because it was the reality of life in that time period. Even today, like I said, the cave at Ben & Head is real. Locals will tell you it exists, and that the air inside feels really heavy, as if something evil still lingers there. So tourists visit it, leaving coins and tokens, unsure whether or not to believe the story about what happened in that cave. But what's undeniable is the staying power of this story. It's lasted for centuries because it taps into a universal fear that under the surface of civilization, there's something hungry waiting. So that is the legend of Sawney Bean, the cannibal king of Scotland, the monster in the cave, and maybe the most successful serial killer who never actually existed. So thanks again, Sarah, for the recommendation. This was a very interesting story to research. I really appreciate that. And if you enjoyed this episode of Horrible Humans in History, make sure you like and subscribe. Share this with people you know like history or scary stories or both, even better. So make sure you're sharing this. And if you have any suggestions, please let me know. Comment on this episode, message me on Instagram, Facebook, whatever. Let me know what you think. I want to talk about who you guys want to talk about. So next time, we are actually doing another listener suggestion. Thank you to Ethan Ackerman. Is that right? You guys know I can't pronounce names. But Ethan, thank you so much for the great suggestion. We will be covering someone who actually was born in the same city I was born in. So a little personal connection, and I don't know how I feel about that. So this one is a little bit personal. So we will be talking about the Green River Killer, who was a serial killer that stalked the Northwest United States from 1982 to 1998. So tune in for the story of Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. And we will see you next week on Horrible Humans in History. Bye.